Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you are and whatever you're doing, I hope you're having a fantastic day. As promised in my previous video, over the next few minutes, I shall be taking you through the exact build that I will be using to take on the Shadow of the Erdtree. And as a bonus, I'll also be giving you some juicy advice and information based on my leftover knowledge from the live preview event of the DLC. Now, please do note, when I get deep into the Shadow of the Erdtree, I will probably change my build around 100 times, because I'm one of these people that can never settle on a build for too long. So it's lucky for me that I've got 10 larval tears saved up. However, for now, after countless hours of research, testing and refining, I think I'm finally happy with the build that I'll be using to tackle the first few areas and start acquiring all of this new awesome loot. Also, I don't want to bore you by droning on about numbers, statistics and calculations for 10 minutes non-stop. So to keep it light and interesting, I'll switch between talking about the build and talking about the DLC, so make sure you stick around and watch the whole thing because you don't want to miss anything important. So let's start out with a few tips and things you want to look out for as you're preparing to enter the DLC. Firstly, to actually enter the DLC, in case you didn't know, along with defeating Mohg, the Lord of Blood, and interacting with Miquella's cocoon, you do also need to defeat Radahn first. So make sure both of these have been defeated, or you won't be able to interact with that cocoon, nothing will happen, and you'll be left wondering, what have I done wrong? It's because you also need to beat Radahn. And even though you can enter into the Shadow of the Erdtree as soon as you have done these two things, the devs have confirmed the difficulty level starts around that of the Forbidden Lands and the mountaintops of the Giants. However, do feel free to complete the whole game should you wish, just obviously don't trigger the ending and then go into New Game Plus, or you'll have to do it all again. In fact, for my first playthrough, this is exactly what I am going to be doing. I'm going to make sure I enter the DLC after doing every single thing in the main game so that I can go in with every possible tool under my belt. Then for subsequent playthroughs, I'm going to try to go in having done as little as possible so I can discover new, unique, hidden interactions and dialogue options. And also, just for reference, I'm around level 195. So that's the level of the build I'll be showing off to you today. However, you can make this work at a much lower level. And on that note, let's now start talking a bit about the build. As you will quite quickly be seeing, you'll understand the theme of this build pretty damn quickly. However, it's what I've been able to do with it to maximize performance that may surprise you. I tend to prefer quicker builds with really fast movesets in From Software games, so something like a Dex Int hybrid works perfectly for me. However, for a mind-blowing reason that I discovered during my playtest, which I shall reveal to you later on in the video, I have opted for a very different build to usual. As you can see, I am using the literal two heaviest weapons in the game, both spec'd into heavy affinity. The Heavy Giant Crusher and the Prelate's Heavy Inferno Crozier. And with basically max strength, we are just going to binky bonk and unga bunga our way to victory. And you know what, let's not keep you waiting too long. Before I start to talk more about the build, let me explain what I mean about this mind-blowing revelation. As most people probably know by now, either because you picked up on it yourself or you've read someone else say it, intelligence builds tended to be very favoured and very strong in the base game, especially the likes of devastating combos such as Terra Magica and Comet Azure, melting every single boss in the game, paired with really powerful intelligence scaling weapons such as the Moon Veil and the Wing of Astel. In comparison, lots and lots of enemies were resistant to holy damage, meaning faith builds were often quite neglected. Armed with this information, I already had a suspicion that the DLC would be quite the reverse, because at the end of the day, once we have faced every single enemy in the game, the developers would like there to be quite an even split between enemies that your build is strong against and enemies that your build is weak against. And because the likes of Faith and Holy have been quite weak in the base game, naturally I believed more enemies would be resistant to sorceries, magic damage and intelligence in the DLC. And upon my first playtest, I was proven right. there is a really heavy influence of the Carian royal family, and of course they are full of sorcerers and mages such as the Glintstone mages and Renala, all of whom are very, very, very resistant to magic damage, meaning intelligence builds are going to suck. Obviously not for all bosses, that would be ridiculous, but I feel like there's going to be a more heavy influence on holy damage and faith builds than there will be on intelligence damage and magic builds. And you may be thinking, this is all great information, Dom, thank you. How the hell does this translate to your Unga Bunga build? Well, my friends, dexterity has always naturally fit more with intelligence, and strength with faith. So even though I am focusing more on strength for this build, I am leaning into faith as well, and I'm doing a strength-faith hybrid, because I believe this combination will exploit the weaknesses of many enemies and make the DLC just that little bit easier. Now that you know that, let me share the rest of the build with you before I give you a few more DLC specific hints and tips. As you can see from my stats, of course, bear in mind I do have Godric's Great Rune active at the moment, and I do have Radagon's Soul Seal as well, but I will be removing Radagon's Soul Seal, so some of these stats are slightly inflated, but long story short, your three highest priorities for your stats are Strength, then Vigor, then Endurance in that order. Obviously Strength so you get maximum damage out of your weapons, then Vigor because you're going to want a buttload of health for the DLC, and finally Endurance because your weapons alone have a combined weight of 50 equip load, which is just insane. So, two talismans that I absolutely guarantee you will need if you want to run this build properly are the Great Jar Arsenal and the Erdtree's Favor +2, which is going to substantially increase your equip load. Next up, we are going to rely primarily on jumping attacks. So we obviously want the Raptor's Black Feathers equipped on our chest because that strengthens jump attacks, and also the Claw Talisman as that does the exact same thing. Aside from this, if your equip load will allow it, I strongly recommend the Fanged Imp Head, because that not only has great damage negation and resistances, but it also increases your strength as well. And then in your other two armor slots, just wear the tankiest armor you can without going into a heavy equip load. And finally, it's at this point I realise it's very silly to have Radagon's Soul Seal equipped, and I'm going to switch this out for the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman. Though Radagon's Soul Seal really does give us an awesome boost to stats, the additional damage it makes you suffer is honestly astronomical in the DLC, and you want anything you can that's going to increase your damage negation, not reduce it. Now that you know what your weapons, armor, and talismans should look like, of course you want to add to this the Frenzied Flame Seal so that you can cast a load of buffs whilst keeping the equip load at 0. And finally, I'll talk about what you want in your Wondrous Physick, your spells, and also the Ashes of War you want to put on your weapons. But first, a few more tips for the DLC. So next up for my final few DLC tips before we finish fleshing out my build. Firstly, you want to collect and save as many rune arcs as you can from the base game, because you never know when you will want that extra little stat boost to help you in a really sticky situation. But also, please don't go using them willy-nilly. Scout the area out first and see if you can take down any big threats without the use of a rune arc, because then you can continue saving them up, as you do not want to run out of them when you may really need that stat boost against a particularly tough opponent. Next up, don't forget to use Torrent. The DLC relies much more heavily on mounted combat now than the base game did. That is exactly why the new Revered Spirit Ashes mechanic will buff him as well as your Spirit Ashes. And as we're talking about new mechanics, do not forget to search high and low for not only Revered Spirit Ashes, but also the new Scadutree Fragments, because this will increase the power level of your Scadutree Blessing, and in turn it will both increase the damage you deal and reduce the damage you take. And of course, my final tip before we finish off the build is to continue watching Dom's Roundtable. You probably already know that I'll be continuing on with my Things You Missed series as soon as the Shadow of the Erdtree comes out. So, as I know many people like to do this, once you've searched through an area yourself, come and check out the channel so you don't miss a single item before you move on to the next area. I have got you covered, my friends. And with that, let's finally finish off this build. There is one crystal tier that is an absolute must in your wondrous Physick, and that is the Stone Barb Cracked tier. This makes stance breaking easier. I mentioned before about the fact that we will be relying heavily on jumping attacks. Jumping attacks deal crazy amount of stance break damage. Obviously nowhere near as much as charged heavy attacks, but you can use them much more frequently. And with the likes of the Raptor's Black Feathers and the Claw Talisman, combined with the Stone Barb Cracked tier, we will be breaking stances just as easily as charged R2s and dealing way more damage in the process. Now, I have also got the Strength Knot tier equipped here for a bit extra damage. However, if you feel like this build is already powerful enough because you can easily deal 4,000 plus damage with one jumping attack once you apply all your buffs, then feel free to swap out for something like the Opaline Hard tier to give yourself a bit more survivability instead. And the second last thing I have for you today before we talk about Spirit Ashes, very simply, is the spells. As always, I recommend Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength to increase your damage. Flame Cleanse Me is always great to have on hand just in case. And then we are going to also equip Black Flame Blade and Blood Flame Blade, and I'll talk about why right now, because this pairs perfectly with the Ashes of War that we'll be using. Now, in theory, there is an absolute ton of Ashes of War that you can apply to your weapons, and the only hard and fast rule is you want to make sure you have the heavy affinity applied, because this will make every swing deal maximum damage. Now, if you equip something like the Poisonous Mist or Chilling Mist Ash of War to your weapons, you will lose the passive status effect by switching this to a heavy affinity. However, it can be reapplied simply by using the Ash of War. So you can easily equip Poisonous Mist on one weapon, Chilling Mist on another. Make sure you equip your left weapon first to use the mist, then go back to dual wielding, use the other mist, and now suddenly you have both poison and frost buildup on your weapons. You can use many different Ashes of War to give you a similar effect, and the one I recommend the most is Chilling Mist on one of my weapons and Crag Blade on the other, because Crag Blade is going to increase your stance break damage even further. So you are stunning enemies with nearly every single attack, allowing you to have maximum critical strikes and allowing the enemies basically zero time to retaliate. Also, every few hits, that frost debuff will proc, making enemies take even more damage from every single one of my attacks. You can really play around and have fun with the Ashes of War, and for enemies that are resistant to frost, that is exactly why we've got Black Flame and Blood Flame Blade, so we can apply Black Flame buildup or bleed to our weapons as well, and you can mix and match all of these depending on the situation, effectively giving the two biggest and baddest weapons in the game any status buildup that you desire. This makes this build insanely tanky, insanely versatile, and just really, really fun to use. And going into the DLC with this build specifically, I'm really excited to get my hands on a throwing blade, specifically the Smith Script Axe, because it will give me a really powerful ranged attack that synergizes perfectly with this build. So even if you're not planning on using this exact build, don't worry, I won't be offended. Let me know what you're planning on running to go into the DLC with down in the comments. And with that, my friends, all that's left for me to say is thank you so much for watching. I hope you have an amazing day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.